Good day. I am Peter Rony, and I live in Blacksburg, Virginia. The title of this YouTube video is I Love Museums. Actually, I really like this slide. I hope I can dwell on it long enough so it will be selected as the video thumbnail. I've been going to museums probably since 1950 or 51 when I was 11 or 12 years old. And that's what, 50, 60 years that I've been going to museums. And even at my age, I'm 76 years old, I still enjoy going to museums. Well, in this video, I would like to survey or comment on some of the great museums that exist, especially the science and technology museums, and also how I've tried to foster interest in such museums with my grandchildren. Now, this may seem inappropriate, but very soon you'll understand why. This is a quote from the famous Edward de Bono, and the quote speaks for itself. And you could read it, but I would like to narrate it here. Up till quite recently, the world was full of things. That is to say, the most useful and respected way to look at the world was in terms of static things. These things were given very definite names and fitted into great schemes of categories and classifications and subclassifications. Everything had its proper place, and being a static thing, it stayed there. To continue to the next paragraph, it is often felt that processes are much more complicated than things. I do not believe this is so at all. It is true that you can see cars and bicycles and boiled eggs every day, but rarely see polarization or feedback or pattern. But this may only be because one has never learned to look for them. It can be just as much fun to look for feedback in daily life as it is to look for snails in the garden or buttercups on a country wall. And one can become just as quick at recognition. These two paragraphs are really great, and I believe in them, and I've tried to communicate these paragraphs off and on to my undergraduate chemical engineering students. Now here is de Bono's list of process concepts, and as I view it, I see that when I teach courses in laboratory or process controls, I use some of these concepts. And why do I like processes? Very simple. I'm a chemical engineer. And chemical engineers deal with processes as their fundamental role as educators and engineers. In fact, we have an acronym, CPI, which stands for Chemical Process Industries. That's what our refineries, chemical plants, mineral beneficiation plants, water desalination plants are. They're processes. And I agree with de Bono that in our educational system, we focus on things. We do not focus on processes. what happens and what changes occur with time. So this is a profound observation and statement. So, why haven't I given you a de bono's classification or distinction between things and processes? Well, I can apply this distinction to science museums. And the way I here do so is a museum can be primarily static or dynamic. So let me identify the San Francisco Exploratorium as a dynamic science museum. A kid goes into the museum and is able to interact with the exhibit, does things, try things, observe changes. I visited the Boston Computer History Museum decades ago, and as I remember it, at that time it was a static science museum. And by analogy, the fabled Floyd Computer History Museum is a static science museum. You look at the display cases and you're supposed to say, ooh, ah, static. Well, let me get to a far more important point. I lived in Hollywood, California for, I would say 19, 20 years. I went to grade school, middle school, high school in Los Angeles. I went to Caltech in nearby Pasadena for my undergraduate years. So I lived in Hollywood for a long time. Now, in the Hollywood area, there was a very well-known observatory called the Griffith Park Observatory. And how do you get it? Well, if you had a car, you drive to it, winding road. If you don't have a car, you take a hike. You start from Griffith Park at the bottom and you hike to the observatory at the top. For a kid 10 or 11 years old, that was not an easy hike. But my father and I made many visits to the observatory, and I am now a chemical engineer and I love chemistry, and I believe that my frequent visits to this observatory had an enormous impact on my decision to become a scientist. I remember there were several dynamic exhibits. They were really quite modest. Well, I would push a button, something happened. That's what they were. I also remember some beautiful space type paintings by Chesley Bonestell. Here it is, 2015, and I remember these paintings which I saw approximately 65 years ago. Well, here is the Griffith Park Observatory viewed from the front. And here are some examples of Chesley Bonestell paintings. Only one of these was inside the observatory, and I don't know which one. But if you look at some of the environments, especially in Star Wars 1, you get a sense for the impact that Chesley Bonestell had on viewers. Well, I have 7 grandchildren, and I really enjoy going to a museum with one or more of my grandsons. It's a wonderful experience. So Aiden, when he was 8, 9 years old, we visited the San Francisco Exploratorium. It is the best dynamic museum in the world, and probably the best science museum in the world. I have videos of Aiden working with the dynamic museums, and the videos are priceless. Well, Aiden and I went to the Exploratorium when it was here in the original building. Well, things have changed. Here is the new Exploratorium building, which is on a pier near the wharf area of San Francisco. I have not visited this museum yet, but I am certain that it is absolutely magnificent inside. Well, let me shift to another museum. During 2013 summer, Chase, Aiden, my wife, and I, we had a grand tour of the Northeast United States and also Canada. What was supposed to be a feature of the trip was a visit to the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto. Well, we made the visit, but it was disappointing because Chase and Aiden were too old for the Science Center. But I sat down and watched all the younger kids going through the museum, and I could just imagine how great those experiences were. So here's the second best science museum in the world. And here's a picture of the front. Now, one of the top three science museums in the world is the National Air and Space Museums in Washington, D.C. Well, except for my two youngest grandchildren, my 5 others have all visited this museums, and I don't remember what they said to me or their reaction, but it's sort of something like, wow, wow. And here's an image that I obtained from Google Images of the entrance to this museum. Well, I visit museums all over the world and all over the United States. Now, here are 2 museums that I have visited alone. The Boston Computer History Museum. I haven't visited it. In fact, I haven't visited the Boston Museum for, 30, 40 years. But I can imagine that the interior is splendid. And here's the Milan, Italy Science Museum, and I visited in the early 1980s. It focused on mechanics, mechanical, electrical, mechanical, and steam systems. And my suspicion is that its group of exhibits have changed remarkably since the early 1980s. Well, I'm leading up to my discussion about the Floyd County Bugbook Historical Microcomputer Museum. I think I've shown you my bona fides that I have visited a variety of museums, and I am thoughtful about their nature and their objectives. So, what are my reactions to the YouTube videos about the museum? I have to rely on the videos because I have not driven the 40 miles to the Floyd County Museum. Now, the Bugbook Museum was created and it is owned and operated by a private individual and not by a group or an organization, and this is really important. The other world-famous museums are operated by a community of individuals or an organization. Now here is the surprising conclusion. It's the second bullet. The Bugbook Museum here in Floyd County is a political museum primarily, and an archival hardware museum secondarily. And what is the political agenda? Simple. It is by the creator, owner, and operator of the museum. It is the agenda of a guy named David Larson. Well, David loves to call himself curator. Curator, curator, curator. You see that word plastered everywhere and stated everywhere on all of his YouTubes. That's nonsense. I now characterize Larson as a politician. And the Bugbook Museum is a political museum. And I come to this conclusion because I understand the Bugbook history better than Dave does. So I can detect obfuscations and deceptions in his statements, written and oral, very easily. And why am I a more authoritative expert? Simple. I wrote all of the bug books. He did not. And I detect, after viewing and reading all of his communications, that he has a more sinister agenda. I am gentle here by calling it a hidden agenda, but it is really a sinister agenda. And that is to exalt his role and to diminish my role in Bugbook history. And this just shouldn't be in a museum. What politician Larson is doing is outrageous. And that's all, folks. I hope you found this video to be interesting. Good day.